This case is about a man who became so obsessed with his high school teacher Mary that he stalked her many, many years after he had left high school. He planned to abduct her and make her fall in love with him. But on the day of the planned abduction, she had her 6-year-old daughter, Beth, with her. But the man didn't care. He bundled both Mary and Beth into the car and ordered Mary to drive at gunpoint. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episode's accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes on YouTube and also as a podcast version if you prefer to listen on the go, all available in the description box down below. It was Friday the 16th of May 1980 when Mary left her house with 6-year-old son Steve. She made her way to a nearby barber's to get him a haircut before dropping him off at his kindergarten class in the afternoon. After that, she picked up her other child Elizabeth, or Beth as she was known to her family, and she took her straight to Carmen's beauty salon off Cleveland Avenue in Roseville. These last-minute haircuts were important. She had planned to move from their home in St. Paul, Minnesota, to the Philippines. This was a big move, and the family were planning on living there for 4 years, but it wasn't totally new to them. Both Mary and her husband Irv had worked previously in the Philippines as Christian missionaries. In fact, they'd only moved back to Minnesota just a year ago, but it was their plan to move back and continue their work. So that afternoon, as soon as Beth's haircut was finished, the pair of them headed back towards Mary's car. Now, as Mary was unlocking the passenger side door of her car, she saw a man approaching them. Now, at the time, Mary assumed that this man perhaps wanted the time or he wanted directions. But as the man got closer to them, he pulled up his shirt and revealed in his waistband he had a gun. He pulled that gun out and he pointed it at Beth's head. And so Mary, not knowing what to do, asked what he wanted, and the man said he just needed a ride. So Mary fumbled with the keys, getting them ready to give over to the man, this Taiwanese American man somewhere in his early 30s. He was wearing thick glasses. She got ready to give him the keys, but he didn't want those keys for himself. Instead, he forced Mary inside and Beth and got Mary to drive. He just pointed her north and said, "Drive that way." And Mary did exactly as she was told, fearing not only for her life, but for the life of her daughter too. And that is when a police vehicle pulled up beside them, and then as they drove on, it went behind them. Now, this man said to Mary, if that police vehicle follows us, if you don't go a different way to the police vehicle, then he would shoot Beth right now. And thankfully, the police vehicle wasn't following them, it just happened to be there. So it did go off at a different direction. And so for now, Mary and Beth were safe and they continued driving on. Mary continued driving for a little under an hour, just following the man's directions, before he told her to pull over. And they were pulling over in this sort of deserted area of Anoka County. And as soon as Mary had pulled over, he tied her up and he gagged her with a rope and tape that he already had. This was clearly a planned attack. If he'd wanted to just get a ride or to take the car, then he would be long gone by now. But Mary was realising that this was very much an attack to abduct the two of them, and she didn't know what he was planning next. Now, what Mary didn't know was that this wasn't just some random abduction. This wasn't just a chance encounter. This attack had been meticulously planned. And Mary had always been the intended target. Mary didn't remember this until it was revealed to her much later on, but she had actually taught the man that was in front of her back when he was in 9th grade. She was an algebra teacher at Alexandra Ramsey High School in Roseville. And when he was a teenager, this boy back then had begun to develop a kind of dangerous obsession with Mary. And it was back in 1975 that he'd actually broken into Mary's in-laws' house, believing that Mary and her husband Irv lived there. He broke in and then he forced Mary's father-in-law and mother-in-law to lie down on the ground, and then he tied them up. And it wasn't long before he realised that he actually had gotten the wrong house and this just wasn't going to work. So he told the pair, now lying on the ground, that he was going to leave them, but if they reported what he'd done, then he would come back and kill them. And of course, that he knew where they lived. He was in their house right now. And so they believed him, and they didn't actually ever report this attack until well after these next events that I'm going to go on to talk about. It was just over 4 years later, after this fumbled kidnapping, that the man learned where Mary lived, and this was in her current house where she was living at the moment. Now, up to that point, he had actually attempted to abduct Mary a total of 4 times. It was only a matter of time before he would succeed. Now, if we go back to the present day of May 1980, and Mary's been tied up, and then the man has proceeded to tie Beth up, and he put this medical tape over their mouths to prevent them from screaming. And after that, he forced them both to get into the boot or trunk of the car. The next thing the mother and daughter duo heard was the car taking off. Now, obviously, they've got no way of really knowing where the car is going, which direction it's going in, and they've really no idea how long they're going to be stuck inside of the boot. For all they knew, the air inside the boot could run out and they could suffocate, or they could get into some sort of accident, some sort of car accident, where if anything went into the back of them, they would most likely die. And then eventually the car came to a stop, and Mary heard the sound of footsteps coming round the car and getting closer and closer to them until eventually the boot popped open. And the man was there, just standing, looking at them. He was just checking in. He was making sure that they were still alive and that they hadn't somehow escaped. He was clearly in some sort of constant state of panic and uneasiness. And so once he saw that the women were still there, he looked closer and he saw that somehow Beth had become untied. Now, what had actually happened was Mary was able to get her restraints so loose that she was able to untie Beth. And this made the man furious. So he retied the restraints, making sure this time that Beth was really, really tightly secured. And then he slammed shut the boot and walked round to the driver's side of the car, got back in and continued his journey onwards. Meanwhile, back at the family home, Mary's husband Irv was sat down with their son Steve, and they were just waiting for a family friend, Sandra, to arrive. They'd planned to have dinner before they went to the Philippines the next day, and they all knew how important this meal was to Mary. And so for Mary not to be there when the friend arrived, they realised this was odd, and they did wait for a little while, but it wasn't long until they realised something was seriously wrong. And so Irv called the hair salon where he knew that Mary would be taking Beth and asked them where they were. And the hair salon told him that they had come in for the haircut as planned, but they'd left about 4:30, so a while ago, and they definitely should be home by now. After that, he gathered a number of friends and locals, especially from his church nearby, and got them all to help him in the search for Mary and Beth. And they started by calling the local hospitals and seeing if any accidents had been reported or if his girls had been taken there. He had no luck, and so he did call the police, but at this point in time, there was another story that was far more pressing in the police's eyes than Irv's story. A little boy called Jason, who was 6 years old, had been abducted and they were looking for him. And Irv would later say that he got the sense that his wife and daughter being missing wasn't a priority, and the police just viewed this as some sort of domestic incident. Meanwhile, somewhere north of the abduction site, the car that the kidnapper was driving came to a sudden stop. Now, this had happened a number of times throughout the journey, and the man would get out, he'd open up the boot, and he would just check that Mary and Beth were still there. And this time when he'd stopped, he'd opened that boot and he'd seen that both Mary and Beth's restraints were a lot looser than when he'd tied them up, and this made him furious. Although the two of them wouldn't have been able to escape, it was likely that it was only a matter of time before they would be able to get out of their restraints. And so in his anger, he decided to get a spare tyre that was stored in the vehicle, and he actually placed it on top of the pair so that they were trapped underneath it and couldn't move easily. After he had done this, the boot was still open, the women were still inside, and he heard a small voice coming from just round the front of the car. It was a 6-year-old boy called Jason Wilkman, and he was with his friend Mark, and Jason had just said hi. In his 6-year-old mind, this precious curiosity and trusting nature of his, Jason says hi, and then he steps around towards the boot of the car, where of course we know that the man is there, and inside the boot there are Mary and Beth waiting tied up. And the man, clearly startled that there was anyone around him, waited for the boy to get closer, and then he grabbed him and threw him in the boot before closing it, running around, getting in the driver's side and speeding off into the distance. The boy's friend Mark just watched helplessly. He couldn't do anything, he couldn't even scream. And once he saw the car drive off, he ran and went and told his parents what had just happened. Back in the car, that bumpy ride carried on for around an hour or so, with Jason in that boot, crying. He's just 6 years old, he doesn't know what's going on. And Mary and Beth at the same time are trying to comfort him. And at one point, Jason hasn't said much, but he does tell them his name, he tells them his age, and he says that he's really sad now because he was supposed to be going to visit his grandmother tomorrow, but being in this car boot meant that he wouldn't make it there now. And Beth, being a kind person wanting to relate to this little boy, said that she felt that way too, and that she was supposed to be seeing her grandmother, but she wouldn't get to either, so she knew how he felt. And it had been a little less than an hour before that familiar feeling of the car slowing down and then coming to a halt happened. This time the boot opened and the man was there. He scooped Jason up, and as he was doing this, Beth saw to the side of her there was a long metal pole, and the man took the pole, he took Jason under his arm, closed the boot, and then walked into the distance. And Mary and Beth lay there quietly, wondering what was happening, and they were desperately straining their ears to try and hear, but all they could hear was footsteps getting further and further away, until eventually there was silence. And this silence continued for around 10 to 15 minutes, until eventually they heard those footsteps coming back towards the car again. They heard the driver's side door open, slam shut, and then they continued forward for around another hour. And this time when they stopped, the man actually forced Beth and Mary to get out of the boot, and he already had another car parked waiting for their arrival. This vehicle was actually a black windowless van, and he forced them in there, where of course they were still tied up. It wasn't long before he took Mary and Beth to the electronics store that he owned on University Avenue. Once they were inside, of course they're still tied up, but he gives them juice to drink, he allows them to use the bathroom, before eventually forcing them back into his van. And then he drove down to 1960 North Hamline Avenue, which was where his family home was. Now, little did Mary know that although they had driven for hours and hours, they were actually just 6 miles away from her apartment. The driving hours and hours was just a ploy that this man had enacted in order to throw Mary off the scent of where he was going. In reality, they were just round the corner from the hundreds of volunteers, family members and police searching for them. When they were in this house, they were forced into a closet, both still tied together, and the closet itself was just 4 foot long. They were tied at the elbows and they were locked inside. I don't think the door was actually locked. From what I can understand from the court documents, it looks as though the door handle from the inside had been completely removed ahead of time, and there was a large pin placed in it, so there really wasn't any way that it looked like they were going to be able to escape. The closet had very clearly been prepared for their arrival because it was already emptied of clothes and a rug and pillows lay on the floor waiting. It was only 1 day after they arrived at the man's house that he decided to tell Mary exactly who he was and why he had been doing this. He dragged Mary out of the closet and took her to the living room area, and of course he left Beth inside still tied up. And when he got Mary into the living room area, he made sure she was tied to a piece of furniture so that she couldn't escape. And then he revealed his identity. He was Ming Sen Shu, and she must remember him, he said. She had taught him in the 9th grade. He said that he blamed her for what had happened to him, for the journey he had taken in life. He'd gotten a B grade in his algebra class, which had stopped him from gaining a scholarship to college, and as a result, he was drafted into the Vietnam War and became a prisoner of war. Of course, Mary didn't know this at the time, but that wasn't even true. A lot of what Ming said wasn't true. In reality, he had graduated top of his class and had even gone on to attend college and had a pretty successful academic record. After that, he raped Mary, something he did a number of times over the following few weeks. Quote, "I don't want your scars to be physical, I want them to be emotional. I want you to feel dirty and degraded. He even recorded these rapes along with many of the conversations that the pair would have. Many of their earlier conversations also included Ming talking about the 6-year-old boy Jason, who he'd obviously abducted and then had gone missing. Ming told Mary that he'd taken Jason deep into the woods and he had threatened him, saying that if Jason told anyone about what had happened to him, then he would kill him. Quote, I just scared him and then fired a shot over his head and then I let him go. What was curious to Mary was that she never actually heard a shot. Now, of course, if Ming and Jason were deep in the woods, then perhaps she just couldn't hear it. Perhaps it was too far away. It was still odd to her though. Ming's story of what had happened didn't really tally with the version of himself of who he was showing her that he was. He seemed much more aggressive, much more violent. It didn't seem as though he would just let this boy, this eyewitness, go. Ming spoke about Jason and what had happened to him a total of 4 times over the following week. He kept excusing his behaviour, saying of course he wouldn't hurt him because the boy wouldn't be able to identify him. He didn't get a good look of who he was. He was wearing these glasses. Ming even said that how was a 6-year-old ever going to pick him out of a lineup? He repeated that he just wasn't worried. And then about a week after the abduction, there was a news report that was broadcast. And that news report said that Mary and Beth had been abducted first before Jason was also added into the mix. Now, of course, he had left behind an eyewitness, Jason's friend Mark. And Ming didn't know this, but although Mark had seen his friend get taken, he was still at the front of the car. And so he hadn't seen that there were another 2 people in the boot. And so the 2 abductions were not connected for a number of days. But it wasn't long before the police turned up something on that search of the site where Jason had last been seen. And this was a license plate from Mary's car. Now, obviously, believing that this number plate could lead the police to Mary and ultimately to Ming, he decided to take it off of the car and just dump it. And it turns out that he had dumped it where he had also abducted Jason from. That meant that now police had a link and they were searching for 3 victims. The news report stated that police were looking for all 3 somewhere east of Wisconsin. But this rang alarm bells in Mary's head. If they were still searching for Jason, it meant that they hadn't found him yet. And she even asked Ming about this, but he simply replied that they were looking in the wrong place, so of course he hadn't been found. They would find him eventually. Ming knew that while there was this massive search on, there was every chance that he would be caught. And so he wanted to throw the police off of his tracks. And so he forced her to write a letter to her husband saying that she wasn't missing and that she had actually decided to leave by choice. She was a runaway and she'd taken their daughter Beth with her. That, of course, didn't work. Her husband, Irv, just didn't believe it and neither did the police. And so when it didn't work, decided to force Mary to write a second letter, this time saying that if they continued the search for Mary, then she would be killed. Of course, nothing was going to stop them searching for Mary, but he was trying anything at this point. Meanwhile, the assaults on Mary continued, but Ming just wasn't satisfied at this point. He had dreamt about this moment for a long, long time, and the experience he was getting was not one that he was happy with. And so one day, he brought Mary out of the closet, and he told her that she needed to be more affectionate with him and more intimate with him willingly. Of course, Mary said that she couldn't do that. She said she had made an agreement with her husband under the eyes of God and that she had promised that she would be with him forever until death do they part. But this didn't go down well with Ming at all. He pulled a clear plastic bag out, and he also got Beth, Mary's daughter, out. And he placed that plastic bag over her and asked Mary if she'd ever seen anyone die by suffocation before and that he was going to kill Beth by suffocation because of her actions. Ming then had covered Beth's entire body with this plastic bag and he looked at Mary in the eyes and he said that it would take between 4 and 5 minutes for Beth to die. And Beth is there and she's conscious during this and she looks up to her mum and she says that her mum mustn't sin. She doesn't want her mum to sin. But in the same breath, she asks if she can please come out from underneath the plastic bag because it's really hot in there. And Mary looked at her daughter and she could see the beads of sweat dripping down her face. And every time she breathed in, the plastic bag would get tighter and tighter to her mouth. And so in an act of absolute desperation, Mary crawled up to Ming and she pecked him on the cheek, but he said that that wasn't good enough. And so then she pecked him on the lips, and that is when he did release Beth. He pulled the bag off of her, and then he continued to kiss Mary. And Ming could very clearly see how much this mother and daughter duo meant to each other, how much they would do for one another, and he really used this against them. He said that if either of them ever attempted to escape, or if one of them did actually manage to leave, then he would keep the other one and he would kill them. And one day when Beth was out with Ming, she did think that she might be able to escape, but she decided against it. Ming had taken her out in his van when he'd gone to work, and he just left her locked in the back of a van, and it was an incredibly hot, sunny day, and the temperatures in the back of the van would have been unbearable. Ming wanted Beth to suffer. And although Beth may well have been able to force her way out of the van, or at the very least bang on the van and got some kind of attention drawn to her, she knew that it just wasn't worth the risk of Ming heading back home after her escape and murdering her mother. And the more Beth and Mary began to play by Ming's rules, the more lenient he became towards the two of them. It was after 10 days of being stuck in that closet, sweating, being raped over and over again in Mary's case, that he decided it was time for them to be able to have a shower. And so he let them use the bathroom and shower. And this was incredible for both Mary and Beth, who hadn't bathed in 10 days. The pair were even allowed to eat upstairs in the kitchen. They were, of course, still tied up to each other to prevent them from running or attempting to overpower Ming, but to be allowed outside of that closet space felt incredibly exciting for both Mary and Beth. And then, about 4.5 weeks after the initial abduction, Ming decided to take Mary and Beth out to a shopping mall. They were still wearing the clothes that they'd been abducted in, and Ming said that they should get more clothes so that they could present themselves as a proper family. He even started referring to little Beth as Bethy, and he would buy her things like board games like Uno so that they could all have this activity to do together at the dinner table. And during this time, it seemed as though Ming's mind had started to drift somewhat away from the brutality of what he'd done and the assaults, and more towards what kind of family life he could have with Mary and Beth. But of course, even within this family fantasy, he always made sure to have Beth right by his side, and he knew that Mary would never try anything. She would never try to escape because he always had that gun pointed at Beth. Even so, Mary was keen to draw some kind of attention to them, especially anything that couldn't be perceived as something she had done right there and then. While she was out shopping at that mall with her daughter and her abductor, she used a traveller's check with her name on it and her details on it, and she hoped that with this activity sort of flagged, the FBI would be notified and police would arrive and save her. But unfortunately, police were never notified of that, and so no one came to save her. Ming was constantly trying to pretend that this was a sort of happy family engagement. And so, on Father's Day, he decided to give Beth the telephone and allowed her to ring her father. This is that phone call.
Hello, Irv speaking.
Hello, Dad?
Yes, Bethy. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Is Mommy okay?
Yes.
That's good. Oh, I'm...
Daddy,
Yes?
Happy Father's Day.
Oh, thank you so much, sweetie.
You're fine, Dad.
Oh, I'm so glad.
We can't talk anymore.
When can you come home?
I don't know.
Can I talk?
Talking milk, okay, Dad?
Can I talk to him?
No.
Okay, you call again.
See you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye, sweetie.
One day, Ming drove Beth and Mary to a Winnebago motorhome in Chicago. He said that it was going to be a sort of vacation for them. And during this trip, he took Beth out on his own in his van. And so Mary was left in the house on her own. And so she opened up the window, one of the windows, and she called out to a group of teenage boys outside, and she told them that she'd been kidnapped and she needed their help desperately. But these boys, they did not take her seriously. They thought that she was joking, so they laughed at her and told her to not make stuff like that up. Although this, of course, came as a massive blow to Mary, it had been a spontaneous moment of bravery, and when she had gone away and thought about it, she realised that there was no way she could guarantee getting out, getting the police there, and being able to get Beth out and safe. And so when she thought about this, she didn't mind so much that the teenagers hadn't believed her and that they hadn't helped her. It was on the 7th of July that Ming left his house to go to his nearby shop to work for the day. Now, Mary knew that he wasn't going to be long. He could be back any minute. The shop wasn't far from his house. But it was at this point that she decided they needed to plan some way to escape. The pair had been held captive for 53 days by this point, and Ming had been getting so comfortable with them being there that he'd actually started talking about buying a camper van for the three of them to live in. And Mary knew that if this camper van plan went ahead, then the situation they could be living in could be even more dire, and it was unlikely that anyone would ever find them. If they were going to escape, they needed to do it now. And so when Ming left for his shop, she and Beth actually managed to force the door up and off of its hinges, causing it to fall open. Now, they were still tied up to each other, but they could actually leave the closet area. It was the first time ever that they'd be out in the house on their own, unsupervised by Ming. They knew, though, that he could return at any moment, and if he came home and they were there outside of the closet, there would be no explaining it, and likely he would kill them. Mary shuffled to the upstairs phone where she dialed the Ramsey County Sheriff Office phone number. Now, frustratingly, she was put on hold twice. All the while, time is ticking away, and she's just waiting, thinking that Ming could return any moment. Eventually, an officer answered, and she told them exactly who she was and where she was being held. Now, of course, she didn't know the address that she was being held at. She'd never seen the front of the house with the address on it, but thankfully, she had found some dry cleaning of Ming's that had an address tag on it, and so she read that out to the officer and asked if someone could be sent immediately. And that is when the officer said that yes, there were people on their way, but could she confirm if Jason was with them? Of course, up to this point, as far as Jason's family are concerned and as far as the police know, he is still with Mary and Beth. He's been kidnapped alongside them, and Mary had to let them know that no, she hadn't seen him since the day they were abducted. As far as she knew, he had been let go of. He had been left to run away, run back home, but he obviously had never made it. Mary knew that Ming had likely killed Jason. And then the officer who was on the phone said that she and Beth should stay in the house and wait for police officers to arrive. But she knew that Ming could return any minute. She wasn't going to risk staying in that house and being killed by him if he did return before the police did. And so she and Beth, still tied together, managed to get out of the house, and they darted behind this parked car and just waited for a few moments, and then the police did arrive. They found them and they ushered them to the safety of one of the police cars. More officers arrived after that, and they headed straight to Ming's workplace where they arrested him. He was taken straight to prison where he was awaiting trial, and whilst he was there, he met another inmate called Richard, and he offered this man a total of $50,000 to take out a hit to have Mary and Beth killed. He was concerned that at trial they would not only be able to identify him in the courtroom, but they would be testifying against him. He knew that if they did that, he would have no chance of being let off for this crime. He did actually mail a $1,000 check to this guy, to Richard, but Richard went straight to the police and he told them exactly what Ming had asked him to do and that he's offering $50,000 to do it. And so the trials went ahead. Now, firstly, the trial for the murder of Jason went ahead, and Ming was found guilty and he was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Mary had to attend that trial. She was testifying in that trial. And the reason there were two trials was because the murder had happened in a different state from where the abduction and the subsequent rapes had happened. And so Mary attended this trial, and while she was being questioned on the witness stand, Ming got up out of his chair and he attempted to lunge towards Mary. Now, thankfully, one of the attorneys saw this out of the corner of his eye and, acting on instinct, managed to grab Ming and pulled him back away from Mary. But Ming wasn't done there. in a horrific turn of events, at the second trial, he actually managed to get close enough to Mary to lash out at her with a knife in his hand and slash her cheek and her face. The wound was so bad that it actually required 62 stitches. And whilst he was there and he had slashed her, he threatened her that if he ever got out, he would kill her. The result of that trial was that Ming was found guilty and he was sentenced to 30 years to life. This sentence was to be served concurrently with the sentence he got for Jason's murder. And with that murder conviction, he actually wasn't convicted of first-degree murder because it was established that they still hadn't found Jason's body and they needed Ming's help in doing that. So as part of an agreement, Ming said that he would lead the police to Jason's body as long as he didn't get a first-degree murder charge. A large-scale search of the Carlos Avery Wildlife Reserve was conducted and Ming was present. He directed officers to the tree line at the edge of the cornfield and said that's where he should be. And it took just over a day, but the search team did eventually find the remains of Jason's body. An autopsy revealed that he'd suffered fractures on the back and right side of his skull. Some old laws were in place at this time that meant that federal lifers had to serve just 30 years before there was a mandatory consideration for parole. And this was only overturned if they were considered a danger to society. Ming was eligible for parole in 2010. Thankfully, though, this was denied. And the judge ruled that Ming was a dangerous sexual predator, and all of his subsequent appeals have been denied so far. Thank you for watching or listening to this episode of Red Rum. I have a recommendation, finally. It's been a while. I've just finished this book, which is None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell, and I really wanted to recommend it. If you like psychological thrillers, this is brilliant. I'd seen this recommended in a number of places for a long time, actually, so I'm really glad I got to it. I think it's twisted, it's really a page turner, it's incredibly addictive, and yeah, it was just brilliant, so I highly recommend that book. Other than that, I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.